The Inputs Outputs tab is used to define the control for each input and output on an Edge VAV controller. The Edge VAV has 4 analog outputs, 4 digital outputs, and 6 universal inputs for a total of 14 inputs and outputs. A 15th input, which is for our flow static pressure sensor, is special and not native configuration. For the analog output configuration, you can individually configure the 4 analog outputs. All the analog outputs are configured for 4 possible configurations: 2 to 10 volts, 0 to 10 volts, 10 volts to 2 volts, and 10 volts to 0 volts. The 10 to 2 and 10 to 0 represent a reverse acting operation. All analog outputs are rated for a maximum of 10 volts DC. For the analog output control type, we have actuator. This is the cooling damper actuator that you will use. The auxiliary heat. This is for any analog auxiliary heat control. This is for the heating valve is for the reheat valve control. The SCR heating is the reheat electronic control. The hot deck actuator is for the hot deck damper control. And the ECM is the ECM motor off the fan. The default AO settings are AO1 will be for the damper actuator. AO2 would be set for the auxiliary heat. AO3 is the primary heating loop, so analog or floating reheat. And AO4 is the hot deck actuator. For our digital output configuration, you can configure each of the 4 digital outputs individually. For example, if the application requires floating control and the drive open, drive closed outputs are backwards, a quick change to the DO configuration is all that is needed to correct the problem. All digital outputs are Form A contacts rated for 24 volts at half an amp. If we look at the output configuration, fan controls a relay to start either a parallel or series fan. Then we have heating stage 1 through 4 relays, the floating drive open, drive close for your valves, an output for the auxiliary reheat, an output for the auxiliary reheat if it's floating, and the exhaust fan itself. Now, it is to note that the exhaust fan control configuration we set up in the control configuration tab earlier. For your universal inputs, for the 6 of them, you only need to assign the input control. And there are 3 input types: resistive, voltage, and Boolean. For your space temp sensor, your space temp set point, and your discharge air sensor, they are all resistive. For your actuator feedback, your hot deck airflow, or your CO2 sensor, they are voltage. And for your fan status switch for the VAV, the occupancy switch, an exhaust fan current switch, or a window contact closure or open closure, they are Boolean inputs. By default, the UI settings are UI1 is space temp, which is resistive. UI2 is the discharge air sensor, which is resistive. UI3, actuator feedback. UI4, 5, and 6 are not configured by default. However, they would be a Boolean input here, if you needed one, a resistive input for UI5, and a voltage output for UI6.